morning, good afternoon, or good evening, and welcome to Inside the Writer's Studio, the podcast where we talk with writers about their lives, their craft, their business, and their latest work. I'm your host, Charlie Lovett, and our podcast is sponsored by Bookmarks. Bookmarks is a literary nonprofit whose programs include the largest annual book festival in the Carolinas. Come visit Bookmarks at our community gathering space and nonprofit independent bookstore in downtown Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Inside the Writer's Studio is also proud to be an affiliate of Libro FM, the audiobook platform that supports your local independent bookstore. Stay tuned at the end of the podcast for more information on Libro FM and a special offer. In this episode, I'll be handing the microphone over to Frank Morelli, middle grade writer, who you may remember from episode 10 of Inside the Writer's Studio. Frank will be interviewing me about my new middle grade book, The Book of the Seven Spells. Frank, take it away.
So great to be here with you, Charlie. And I just want to say congratulations on your first middle grade book. It's great to have you in the fold of middle grade literature. So I wanted to start out by asking you about your reasoning for wanting to go back into writing for children. Why is that something why did that appeal to you?
Yeah, so I had written almost by accident. I became a children's playwright. My wife got a job at Summit School directing a third grade play, and she came to me and she said, I can't find any material for third graders that sort of fits our philosophy of drama for children that age, which was that it should be fun, that it shouldn't talk down to the kids, that the roles should be equally split among the children. There shouldn't be one star and somebody else who was a bush. And so she said, "You're a writer, write me a play." And so I wrote a play, and that led to writing plays for kids at two different ages at Summit for about 11 or 12 years. I think I wrote about 20 plays altogether, and just about all of them ended up being published and have been performed in thousands of productions around the world. They've done really well in that sort of elementary school, middle school, high school zone, because I think of those very reasons that we divided the parts equally. We didn't write down to the kids. We made them fun and funny. And so I had that experience of a decade or more of not only writing for children, but in many ways collaborating with children. And when you're a playwright, that your actors are part and parcel of the creation of the piece that you're writing. And so invariably I would take ideas from the kids and make little changes and watch what they did on stage and see what worked and what didn't work when I was editing for publication. And so I really liked that. I liked being around children. I like seeing their creativity and their excitement about new material. And so then I started writing novels for grownups, and it became clear that I couldn't really do that and hold down my job as writer in residence at Summit at the same time. So I retired from that job after about 12 years. And, a few years in, I thought, I like this. I like writing novels. I like writing novels that are sort of about old books and things of that sort. But I didn't want to be sort of pigeonholed and do the same thing for the rest of my career. I felt sort of the same way about writing children's plays. I liked doing it, but I didn't want to do the same thing forever. So I went to my agent. I said, "Look, I want to keep writing novels for grownups, but I really miss connecting with kids through my writing. But I'm not really that interested in YA. At that point, YA was pretty dark, and it was vampires, and there's lots of sort of romance and unsuccessful romance in YA, and I wasn't particularly interested in that. And my agent said, "Well, have you thought about writing for middle grade?" And I said, "No." And I didn't know that there was a sort of a genre called middle grade books. I of course had read many such books as a child, but that was before they were labeled that way. So she sent me a box of middle grade books that were, authors who were represented by her agency, and I, looked through some of those, and I thought, yeah, this is right where I want to be, where we can have adventure and peril, and we can deal with some tough topics, but we can also have a lot of fun, and we don't have to worry about people falling in love or people drinking and smoking cigarettes and all those sorts of things that sort of can come into play when you're writing for a high school or a YA audience. And with the experience I've had both while I was writing the book, I had the opportunity to share it with young listeners. And some of them really became part of the writing process. I mean, they would say, well, wait a minute, a few days ago you read us a chapter that said this, and now you're telling us something contradictory. And they would catch all these little errors. And then since the book was published a week or two ago, I've had the opportunity to visit some schools and again share it with young readers. And I feel vindicated because I really wanted to get back to that point where I could see the look in kids' eyes where they're excited about something that I'd written. And it's nice to be back at that point, and to have kids really excited about reading the book.
I just love what you say about collaborating with children. Both of us come out of the world of education, so hanging around middle school students, especially for me, has been like the last 20 years of my life. And I just remember I was talking to you about the in the beginning of your book, you wrote like kind of an author's letter, and one of the things you talked about was especially collaborating with various children when you were actually writing the book. Could you tell us a little bit about that experience of collaborating with kind of like your pre-readers of the
Yeah.
book of the Seven Spells?
It was, it happened again almost by accident. I had written about half of the manuscript, and then my wife and I were in England, and we were going to go on a trip with some families from our church. The kids were singing in a choir at Canterbury Cathedral for a week, and so a family we've been really good friends with, they came to visit us at our cottage in Oxfordshire, and then we were going to drive across England over to Canterbury. After they got done visiting us. And so we decided we would take the two girls in the back of our car because the dad had never driven in England before. And we thought, you don't need two kids in the back of the car while you're trying to do that for the first time. So we took the two girls in the back of our car, and they were kind of, they were sisters, there was some rambunctiousness in the back of the car. And my wife said, hey, do you mind if I just read to them? I said, what are you going to read to them? She goes, what about that manuscript you've been working on? And keep in mind that I almost never share manuscripts with people until they're done. So this was a big ask, but I thought, okay, sure, I'm okay with that. So Janice didn't know what was in it. She hadn't read any of it. She picked it up out of my bag and started reading to the kids, and they settled down. And then we got to Canterbury, and they told the other kids that we'd been reading this story. And it sort of just developed that every day, in the afternoon, they would have choir practice, then they would sing the evening service, and we'd all go to dinner someplace. And then they'd kind of like about 8:30 at night, they'd sort of assemble in our bedroom for story time. And we would read them a chapter or two of the Book of the Seven Spells. And so when we got back to the United States, they kept hounding me to finish the book. And so in addition to being, good editors, and I said, especially good at sort of catching those little inconsistencies, because when you're building a world, it's really easy to set up a rule and then forget that rule and accidentally break it later on. So they were really good at sort of keeping me on track with that. But again, also, I had that opportunity to see the look in their eyes to see what was really working and what maybe wasn't. When are they getting fidgety and it's not working quite as well? So we ended up, I ended up reading the whole book to them over a period of a few weeks after we got back and after I finished writing it. And then, one thing led to another. The book got submitted different places and went into, my agent and I worked on it. I sort of rewrote the whole back half of it. I sort of redefined the characters a lot more specifically, especially with respect to their cultural backgrounds. And when COVID hit, I thought, what can I do to help out families I know that have kids who are stuck at home? And so we did it again. We had story time on Zoom every night for 2 or 3 weeks, and I would read a couple of chapters of the rewritten version of the Book of the Seven Spells. And then a little bit later on, we did the same thing again on Zoom. We read, because I was working on book 2 at that point, and I read them book 2. So it's been fun to sort of interact with them in a lot of different ways. One of those kids came up to me last night. We had a book launch last night, and she said, oh, I'm so glad to have the book. I just keep flashing back to 2020 when you'd read to us over Zoom, and I would lie in bed after story time was over, just wondering what was going to happen next. And, it's great to hear that sort of thing from somebody that you've been reading aloud to.
I definitely resonate with that. I oftentimes like to take unfinished work and just kind of, share it in my classroom without any real context and not
Mm-hmm.
telling them that it's from anything. And I always find that children are a lot better at giving feedback, at least honest feedback, than
Yeah,
even
yeah.
adults are. Like sometimes adults will tell you what you want to hear, or they'll go around the outskirts of what they're trying to tell you, but kids will never do that, and they will always go right to the point. And it's just refreshing sometimes. So I'm glad you had that experience too.
Yeah, it really is. And the other thing they'll do, they're very honest in their feedback. And the other thing they'll do is they'll say, "What if this happened? What if you did that?
Yes.
What if this character did so and so?" Like they will throw out ideas, and some of them are great ideas. The audiences I've been talking to lately of school kids, one of the things I asked them is, I said, "Okay, look, and there's 7 spells in the Book of the 7 Spells. In book 1, we use 1 spell. In book 2, we use 4 spells. So I need 2 more. Give me ideas for spells." And the kids have fantastic ideas. It's so great to listen to them.
It is great to listen to them. They really are great at motivating too, because once you have read even a portion of your story to a child, there is that lingering feeling where it's like, oh, I'm left them hanging. I need to give them more. So it always gets me continuing to write. So that's great. One thing I wanted to ask you about is about your previous experiences writing for adults and even your playwriting experience. You have written so many books for adults and with wide acclaim, New York Times bestsellers, plays that I've actually seen produced at Summit School, since we kind of had common educational backgrounds a little bit. So I was wondering if any of those experiences, whether playwriting for children, I think probably did translate in, but writing for adults, did any of that translate into the writing for the Book of the 7 Spells?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the one thing I didn't want to do, as I said about the playwritings, I didn't want to write down to the children. I just wanted to tell a good story, and make the protagonists of that story children. That's really kind of the only big difference between this book and novels that I've written for adults would be, it's a little shorter, and the protagonists are children instead of grown-ups. That's, other than that, it's the same kind of, the adventures maybe moves along a little faster and things like that. But I really didn't want to write down to kids. But definitely, the other book I have that was just published was a thriller, for adults, called The Enigma Affair. And I started thinking about, you know, how did I learn to write a thriller? How did I internalize what a thriller is? And some of it was, sure, by reading, Frederick Forsyth, or Ken Follett, or some of those other writers. But I think a lot of it was watching Alfred Hitchcock movies and listening to Hitchcock, like reading his interviews with Francois Truffaut. And I learned so much about pacing, about building tension, and all of that came into play in both in the Enigma Affair and in, the Book of the 7 Spells. One of the things you learn is you alternate these sort of intense action sequences with, quieter passages. Hitchcock does that in the film. I do that in the book. And as you get closer and closer to the end of the film or the book, those intense action sequences come closer and closer together. That's something, and I didn't think about the fact that I learned that from him, but I definitely did. And that certainly plays out, in both my most recent adult novel and in the Book of the 7 Spells. And then as far as the playwriting goes, when you're trying to establish a character on stage, and you have a very small number of lines in which to do that. I mean, I typically, my plays would be divided into 3 acts, because we had 3 classes of third graders at Summit. And so, and then each kid would have about 12 or 15 lines, right? So that means throughout the whole play, the character is going to have, you know, 35 lines, something like that. And that's a very small amount of text in which to establish character. And so I kind of got good at figuring out ways to, very quickly sort of give a hook to a character that the kid could grab a hold of. Now, in a fun sort of fairy tale class play, the character may not go a whole lot deeper than that hook. In a novel that's 60,000 words long, that hook can just be the beginning of the way that we dive into the character. And so, for instance, we find out right at the very beginning that Celia, there's 4 protagonists in this book. And so Celia is very passionate about solo athletic endeavors. We find her rock climbing at the very beginning of the book, about to fall off of a cliff. I thought it would be great if I could begin a book with a cliffhanger. I always ask kids if they know what a cliffhanger is, and they do. And then I say, "You think I could put one in the first sentence?" They go, "No, you can't do it in the first sentence. It's at the end." So I have her literally have her hanging off a cliff in the first sentence. But that's her, her hook kind of at the beginning is her athletic ability. And Juliet is sort of the queen of the school. She's a sort of a social butterfly when we first meet her. And Sebastian is he's a movie buff. He's like everything for him is movies, movies, movies. And Angus always has his nose in a book. Everything for him is books, books, books. And so they each have these the same sort of hooks that I might have given to a character in a play, but then the amount of time that we get to spend with them allows us to go much, much deeper and find out like why is Sebastian fascinated with movies? Well, it's because his family is from South America and his parents, that's how they learned how to speak English was watching movies. And so all of these passions lead to something a lot deeper about the character. And they also all lead to some talent or ability that's going to come to play when these four kids get together on this magical adventure where they have to, even though they're very different from each other and probably wouldn't have liked each other in the real world, if they have to come together, become friends, become a team to solve the problems that are in front of them.
I'm glad that you were just talking about your characters, because Celia, Juliet, Sebastian, and Angus, just incredible character development in the Book of the Seven Spells. One of my favorite parts about it is just how these characters are so diverse and how they interact with each other so seamlessly and so authentically. So I'm wondering, like, what do you do before you write the book to make sure that these characters are so vivid in your mind that you're able to create it on the page the way you have?
So some of it was before and some of it was during. I certainly knew. Talk about those four passions that the kids had. I knew about those. Juliet also is very passionate about music. That's kind of her underlying thing. I realized after I had created those four passions: solo athletic endeavor, old books, movies, playing the piano, that I have all those passions. I mean, duh. Yeah, that's called being a lazy writer, right? But and also that all four of those kids use those passions as a way to kind of escape from the difficulties of their lives, and they all have sort of different difficulties. So some of the things I knew at the beginning is I knew what they were passionate about. I knew what strengths those passions were going to give them. I knew the things in their lives that they were going to be maybe not running from, but just at times trying to move past. Like Celia and Angus, their mother passed away fairly recently in an accident. Juliet is worried that her parents might be headed towards a divorce. And Sebastian is just sort of dealing with the realities of living in an immigrant household. And so most of those, except the one I just mentioned about Sebastian, most of those I knew up front. And so that gave me sort of a structure to start to build these characters in. The other thing is that having written plays for 12 years, when you exercise a particular muscle, it gets strong. And my dialogue muscle got pretty strong because I wrote nothing but dialogue for 12 years. And kids talk to each other a lot. And these kids talk to each other a lot in this book. And that gave me a really good opportunity to see how they spark off one another. And what does that tell me about the character? When is Juliet sort of condescending to what she considers to be these sort of nerds that she's been forced to hang out with, and what is it that makes her come around and understand that they're more like her than they are different from her? When is it that all of these kids sort of have this revelation that these other kids they sort of had a disdain for are more alike than they are different, and that they can be stronger as a team than they can be as individuals? And how's that going to work? And that plays off through the things they do together and the way they talk together. And then there was a part of it that happened in the process. So after I finished the first draft, I still don't in this book tell you how old the kids are. I really wanted my readers to be able to decide that for themselves. But the other thing is, in the first draft, I didn't say anything about their cultural or ethnic heritage or backgrounds, or they were just four kids. There were two boys and two girls, and one boy and girl set were brother and sister. And when I went back to rework it, I thought, these kids are already diverse in terms of the way they approach the world. Let's make them diverse in terms of their cultural background and their heritage as well. And let's try to find some ways that might impact the story. And I kind of went the what seems like on the surface of it the opposite way with Angus and Celia. I made them twins instead of just brother and sister, but they're just wildly different from each other. And then Juliet, her mother is Indian, her father's from Nigeria, and her, so she is from an immigrant family, although she was born in the United States. And then Sebastian's family is from Peru, and his parents and his older brother came to the United States shortly before Sebastian was born, and so they both have that kind of immigrant experience, but in very different ways. I mean, Juliet's parents, for instance, grew up in their home countries speaking English, whereas Sebastian's did not, and that really upped the ante. You have scenes where the bad guy, the villain in this novel, is this guy named Otto Bodkin, who is the mayor of this town, Headley Helm, where they live. And he's trying to get his hands on the Book of the Seven Spells, this very, very powerful magic book that will allow him to be a very, very powerful and unpleasant person. And the kids are trying to keep them from getting his hands on this. And but everybody in Otto Bodkin's family is pretty unpleasant, including the children. And so the kids are sort of the lead bullies in the school. And it's one thing when you have a character who's being bullied, who's being teased on the playground, and you just say, oh, Boris Bodkin is teasing Sebastian or is bullying Sebastian. But when Boris Bodkin is saying things to Sebastian like, go back to where you came from, you don't belong in this country, go home, why don't your parents speak English? That's a whole different level. That's, first of all, it's a lot more specific. It can teach us a lot more about character, but it also raises the stakes beyond just childhood bullying, because it echoes things that adults do in the real world as well. And so that was sort of figuring out their cultural and ethnic backgrounds really helped me to sort of fulfill them as characters. And then it allowed them to interact in interesting ways, because they do have to come to understand each other as very different people, but they also have to find a way that these very different people really complement each other. And they begin to discover things like one person's strengths can help one of the other people with their weaknesses or with their fears. They all have things that they're afraid of, that they have to confront in the course of this book. And when they learn that they can use their strengths to help the others confront their fears, when they learn the value of making a sacrifice to help somebody else out, is when they really become not just friends, but what Dickens called fellow passengers to the grave. People who really are empathetic towards one another in spite of their differences.
How did you wind up landing on the particular cultural backgrounds that you landed on? And then when you were collaborating with the children, did you wind up getting any feedback in that area?
So, I wanted to have some cultural diversity. I wanted to have some kids who were of color, but I didn't want it just to be like, well, there's a black kid and there's a Hispanic kid. I didn't want to look like I was just checking off boxes. And so I thought, Peru, that's different. You don't hear a lot about people coming here from Peru, and that just felt a little different. And it also gives this opportunity for the bully to keep saying, go back to Mexico. And Sebastian's like, dude, I'm not from Mexico. I've never been to Mexico in my life. I've been within 1,000 miles of Mexico. And then the same thing with Juliet. I didn't want it to just be sort of anything that could feel cookie cutter. I wanted her to have something really specific. And I liked the idea of her being biracial. I liked the idea that she could pull sort of cultural traditions from her parents. One of the things she does when they get in these sort of tight situations is a lot of times she'll refer to just sort of a saying or an old folk saying that her father told her, that and so I went and sort of researched these Nigerian sayings about it's things like when you stay together, the lion stays hungry, because you're talking about, well, should we break up? And she's like, no, keep the lion hungry. Fishing without a net is just bathing. Those kind of really got to be a part of the story in a way that she could sort of take the wisdom of her ancestors and bring it to the problems that they were facing. So I liked having her come from from places that had their own sort of historical wisdom that had been handed down in kind of in a folk manner, that it was the sort of thing that her dad would just say at the dinner table when things came up, that could be a part of the way that she learned how to solve problems. And also, by making her both a person of color from a multiracial family, but also sort of the social queen of the school at the beginning of the story, we get a sense that there was a journey there. Like when she showed up in first grade and was the wildly different kid, she was not going to be the popular kid. She had to really work for it. And we learn about how she went about that, and some of the skills that she acquired trying to do that are things that she then later on applies to slightly more noble aspirations. So yeah, the kids that I don't remember specifically talking to my child listeners about those decisions when I was making them, but when I came back and read them the rewritten book that had those characters, sort of more culturally specific, they really liked that. A lot of them felt like it was a more accurate representation of the kids in the schools that they go to, and the kids that surround them in their lives. And as I said, it gave me a rich field in which to work, because you bring these different traditions in, and people have different ideas about how to solve a problem, different basis of knowledge, different talents, and it just makes it a lot more fun to spend time with the four of them.
Writing about characters who have like rich cultural backgrounds requires a pretty decent amount of research, and
yeah,
kind of reading and rereading and trying to get it perfect. But I always feel like it gives you a chance to really grow as a human being, really, and also as a writer. Could you talk to us a little bit about the process of trying to gather the information that you needed in order to create the characters that you did?
Sure.
And how that helped you grow?
To be honest, sometimes I would just go on Facebook and say, "Hey, what would you say if you were from Peru and you were a native speaker of Spanish, but not just Spanish, but in Peru, in that part of South America, and you went into a situation and you were going to say, where a kid in America would go, holy cow," or and I have friends on Facebook who are from all over the place, and they would go, "Hey, here's what you say," and that so being able to sort of directly consult people was really helpful. Kind of, this is definitely not a book about current events or anything like that, but just observing in our culture what was going on with the immigrant experience, with the Black experience, with while I was working on this book, over the years that I worked on this book, we had Charlottesville, we had Let's Build a Wall, Let's Send People Back Home, we had a lot of things going on that we had Black Lives Matter, we had I just from all of that, I learned so much that's not only in this book but in the second book too. Juliet has a conversation with her dad about how he got pulled over for basically driving while Black, and he has the conversation with her about how you have to behave around police officers if you're Black, and so a lot of that was just paying attention, what's going on in the world around me. And then I was also really lucky to have Georgia McBride as my publisher and my editor, and Georgia's Black, and she was an incredible sensitivity reader for me. Told me exactly when I got it right, pointed out to me when I got it wrong, and helped me, and also helped me understand why it was wrong, not just saying, "Oh, you can't say this," or "You should say that," but helping me understand, the background behind that. And every once in a while it made me really happy. She said something about how I can't even remember what the comment was. I said something about Juliet's hair, and she said, "Oh, you got the thing about the hair just right." I said, "Well, I watched Chris Rock's documentary about Black hair, and it's like, if you haven't seen it, and you're white, it's an amazingly fascinating and eye-opening movie." But those are the kind of things that, just to try to try to be aware of different cultures, of the struggles of different groups of people in this country, and how can that become a part of a story without weighing down the story. You know, you don't. I didn't want it to be a book about, oh, here's how hard it is to be in this culture and that culture. And I wanted it to be, here are four kids who are really different, and they have a common goal, and they come together. And oh, by the way, there's a magic house and an ancient library and a book of spells, and they learn tricks from Harry Houdini, and so on and so on and so on. Like that's really the fun part of the story, but the undergirding it, you know, is the fact that I wanted them to feel like real people with real problems and real backgrounds, and that they bring both their problems and their strengths to the challenges that they face.
You know, you talked a little bit about all those cool things that show up in the book that are very much fantastical and just really just make the book so magical. And so I wanted to ask you this: what drew you to be a fantasy writer? Why is that the genre that you feel so strongly about?
So, you know, I've never been a huge reader of fantasy. I definitely read The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings a lot when I was a kid. I read Narnia often when I was a child. Uh, and so I definitely had that background of understanding what world building was. And you know, I'd read the Harry Potter books. And I liked the idea in the Harry Potter books of, this is not a different world. This is not the Shire. You know, this is just our world, but magic exists in it, and some people know about that. And that's kind of the world of Headley Helm. It's our world. It's a fictional town. I don't ever say what country it's in. It's really interesting to me. I've read this book to both to kids in England and in kids in the United States. And kids in the United States think it's set in the U.S. and kids in England think it's set in England. So, you know, um, but it's, you know, it's essentially our real world more or less now. Kids have cell phones and kids go to school and so on and so forth. But magic exists, and these four children discover that fact, and most people around them don't know about that. But the bad guy does know about that, and so I liked sort of that level of fantasy where it wasn't, you know, completely a new world with different creatures and everything else. It was just, you can do some magic. Um, and I think when I started thinking about this book, you know, I don't want to say that I was coming at it from my brand, but I was coming at it from my own passions that I had included in the books that I write for adults. And a big part of that is my fascination with, some people might say, unhealthy obsession with rare and antiquarian books. I mean, I'm a collector of books. I've been an antiquarian bookseller over the years, and you know, just sort of been in that world for all of my adult life. And so I thought, well, how could that be part of a book that's for middle graders? Well, the first thing you think about books like, you know, Mr. Limoncello's library, and you think about books where libraries are a part of the book. And I'm like, well, of course there has to be a library, but you know, it needs to be a really cool library. So what would be a cool library? Well, one that only they can find would be pretty cool. One that had magical books in it. I like that idea. One that is in itself magical, in that it is capable of growing on its own and adding books to itself. And maybe one that only shows up every 100 years, and so the kids just happen to be there at exactly the right time. And we later find out there's a reason for that. So those are all. So really, it was the idea of the library itself, and then what can be cool about that kind of led me to magic, to the idea that I wanted to have a library, but I wanted it to be so special to these kids. And that led me to magic, and eventually to the Book of the Seven Spells itself. And once I had kind of made that decision, then it got to be really fun, because you get to make up magic stuff, and you get to pull in the past. We get to find out about the last person who owned this library, this magician named Moriarty Mortimer, who was around 100 years ago, and we get to find out about people who were around even before that. So it gives you a chance to create this whole backstory for the library, and the kids, you know, literally kind of discover this whole world that they didn't know was there. And and it's always fun to be in on a secret. And so these four protagonists get to be in on this secret, and nobody else in town knows that they're the heroes. They're saving not just this town, but who knows, maybe the whole world. And I love that idea of and it's in the Enigma Affair too. I love that idea of these hugely important things that are saving huge numbers of people or turning a tide of evil back the other way, and nobody knows it's going on. It's just 4 or 5 people taking care of business and going back home, and then but the reader gets to know about it. So that there's a certain amount of that in this book as well.
Some of my favorite stories have that exact aspect to it. And I think that
Yeah,
might be one of the reasons why people are so addicted to shows like Stranger Things and
sure,
others
sure.
that where it's just such a small group of people that are just saving the world.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
here's a weird question for you. What book in the series will we have to wait to get to the spell that you would most like to use from the Book of the Seven Spells?
So I hope, my plan is this will be a trilogy. As I said, I have written book 2, but I don't want to work on book 3 until we know for sure we're going to get book 2 published. So everybody, write letters to the publisher and tell them you want to see book 2. And then because also, you want to get book 2 edited so you don't put something in book 3 that contradicts something that's in book 2. I actually had to do a little bit of last minute editing on book 1 so that it stayed consistent with book 2. But in spite of the fact that I'm going around asking kids to tell me what should be the last 2 spells, I actually know what the last spell is. But honestly, I think the spell that I would want to use the most might be the first spell, the one that they use in this book. But it's either the first spell or the last spell. Yeah. So, but it's been really fun coming up with those. We had a family visiting us for spring break one year, and we were just sitting around the kitchen table, and I just said, I need spells. I need, like, if you could only have 7 magic spells in the whole world, what would they be? And we had this great brainstorming session, and I think a lot of the spells came out of that session. And honestly, I don't know which ones were my ideas and which ones were somebody else's ideas, because we were just writing down on a piece of paper all these ideas for spells. But yeah, I think either the first one, which readers will learn about in this book, or the last one, which is going to be at the end of the third book.
It's one of the greatest things about being an author is that one day you can be just making coffee for yourself in the morning, and by afternoon you are a full-fledged wizard. So if you could have middle grade readers take one thing from the first book of the Book of the Seven Spells, what would that be?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a book about magic and adventure and excitement, and that's all on the surface, but it's underneath. It's a book about friendship. And I guess if they could take one thing, it would be, don't assume things about people, because the person who's sitting next to you that you might think is completely different from you and you have nothing in common with, and you really don't really care for that person, they could end up being your best friend. They could end up saving your life. They could end up introducing you to the thing that becomes your passion for the rest of your life, whether that's playing the cello or doing algebra, And so the kids all begin with misconceptions about one another, and they end as incredibly close friends. And to me, that's the real beauty of the story here. That there's a lot of fun. There's danger and peril, and there's parts that feel like video game excitement kind of things. But underneath that, it's a story about these 4 very different kids, not only learning how to be friends, but learning how when they empathize with one another, when they care for one another, they can actually accomplish much, much more than they ever could have done on their own.
It's the perfect message, and one that I think middle grade readers really, really need to be reminded of, no matter what age they're living in.
Yeah.
And I enjoyed the book myself, and I really hope that middle grade readers will flock out to the bookstores to pick up copies of the Book of the Seven Spells so that we can make sure we get to that second book and the third book.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I love from being on your podcast many years ago was being able to answer the 10 questions, which is one of the ways that on Inside the Writer's Studio, you typically finish out each of the episodes. So I'm pretty pumped up that I get a chance to ask the questions now, put you on the spot.
Yeah, I'm on the spot here. And I answered the questions a few weeks ago with reference to my novel, The Enigma Affair. So I'm going to try to. I haven't really thought about what I'm going to say, but I'm going to try to answer these questions this time as a middle grade writer. So with with sort of specificity towards this book. So we'll see what I end up saying. I don't know. It'll be interesting.
Awesome. Let's see if I can get you sweating a little bit here.
Okay.
So first question is, what word do you love to work into your writing?
I think for this book, it has to be magical.
That's a good choice. That is a good choice. What word do you hate to encounter in other people's writing?
Definitely. I just see that word used a lot in a sense that it doesn't add any meaning to the sentence.
Yeah, I feel like I use that word a lot in emails. You're going to have me reading over my emails a lot
Well,
of
we all
times.
do. I mean, I'm sure somebody will go and find it 5 places in this book now that I've said that.
Oh, that's of course. Where's your favorite place to write?
Well, I like to write in my office at home, but with this book, I'm going to flip that question around a little bit and say, where was my favorite place to read it to kids? And because we did it everywhere. And I think one of the most fun is we ended up after choir practice one night in Chick-fil-A reading a chapter of the Book of the Seven Spells. And I don't know what the other people in that restaurant thought was going on, but we were having a good time.
I mean, that sounds like a perfect storm right there. Somebody reading the Book of the Seven Spells to you while you have a giant lemonade in front of you.
Yeah,
I don't think you
exactly.
could beat
Yeah.
that. Where could you never write?
um, someplace where there's a loud television playing a news broadcast or something. If there's, if it's just music or something like that, I can usually work. But if there's spoken words behind me, I find it hard to concentrate.
I've gotten better and better at writing with a bunch of middle graders around
Yeah.
me screaming. I would not recommend it. To what rule of grammar do you pay least attention?
um, Two of them probably. Ending sentences with prepositions. I think that's just silly. There's no reason for that rule to exist, really. Uh, and and sentence fragments. I love a good sentence fragment,
Oh, me too.
especially at the end of a paragraph or someplace where you can just sort of use it as a punch.
Yeah, there's nothing better than a partial sentence to speed up your writing too. If you're trying to get a scene to move more quickly and show more action. I love sentence fragments. What are you reading now?
Right now, I just finished a book by Kate Forsyth called The Crimson Thread because she interviewed me the other day about the German occupation of Crete during World War II. Absolutely fascinating, and has so much overlap between what she's writing about and what I'm writing about. And so now I finished that yesterday afternoon, so I have to go back to the pile and see what's on the top of the pile. I think it's probably the new book by Frank Morelli, if I'm not mistaken, because we're going to be doing some events together here in a little bit.
That's excellent. I heard that's a great book. What book would you like to have written?
When I look back at middle grade books that I have loved, I think the book I would like to have written is From the Mixed Up Files of Mrs. Basil E. Frankweiler by E.L. Konigsberg. It's about two kids. It was written when I was a child. I think it came out in the late 60s or early 70s, about these two kids who run away from home to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City, and then to get caught up in a mystery about a statue. But I loved that book as a kid, and I loved the imagination that went into the adult putting herself in the shoes of the children, uh, normalizing this thing. I mean, obviously, if your kids actually ran away and hid out in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, you'd be terrified. But in the world of this book, she makes it just this cool thing that they do, and I always thought that was wonderful.
Oh my goodness, I second that. That book, I was obsessed with that book when I was in middle school. I think it's one of the reasons why I would say that's one of the reasons why I decided to write for middle grade. Just definitely an inspiration. What's a type of book that you would like to write, but you probably never will?
I would love to write a full-on sci-fi um, book. I mean, a book like Andy Weir's The Martian or Becky Chambers' To Be Taught If Fortunate. But I don't think I have enough sci in me to to do the sci-fi. But yeah, it would be fun.
I think for me, I would always wanted to write something like, I remember reading your history of Summit School that you wrote, and just
Yeah.
like writing like a book of nonfiction about a specific place and doing like all the research behind it. It sounds really, really fun and interesting to me, but then at the same time, there's not enough fiction involved in it, so I don't know how much motivation I'd have to finish
Yeah. I mean, there's,
it.
one of the things about nonfiction is it kind of takes the pressure off, right? You don't have to make stuff up.
Yeah, the story's
But
written
on the
for
other
you.
hand, you don't get to make stuff up, so it's
That's
sort of a
that's
double-edged
exact
sword.
that is exactly right. Cut from the same cloth. All right, this is a great question. What would you like to hear a reader tell you?
For this book, I just think I would like to hear kids say, I had a great time, bring on book two. There's a sentence at the end of this book that when I've read it out loud to kids, I get a gasp. And I'm hoping what that gasp means is we want to see what happens next.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think you're going to hear that quite often after people read the Book of the Seven Spells, Charlie. And I just want to say it was an absolute blast and a dream to have an opportunity to interview you about this book. And I'm really hoping that a lot of readers find this book because it is just phenomenally written and just it is fun. And I think the message behind it is just perfect for middle grade readers at this point in time, and really
Thanks.
any point in time.
Thanks. I'm so glad you enjoyed it. Thanks once again to middle grade author Frank Morelli, whose latest book is Breaking News, for coming on the podcast to interview me today. You can buy his book and the Book of the Seven Spells wherever books are sold, and you can get signed copies of the Book of the Seven Spells at bookmarksnc.org. Inside the Writer's Studio is sponsored by Bookmarks, a literary nonprofit that runs the largest annual book festival in the Carolinas and operates a community gathering place and nonprofit independent bookstore in downtown Winston-Salem, North Carolina. To find out more about Bookmarks and all its programs, visit www.bookmarksnc.org. Inside the Writer's Studio is proud to be affiliated with Libro FM. Unlike other audiobook platforms, Libro FM supports your local independent bookstore. Whether you buy a single book or, like me, a monthly subscription, you can link your account to your local store or to Bookmarks to support literary community. For a special 2-for-1 offer, go to Libro.fm and use the discount code WRITERS. If you've enjoyed Inside the Writer's Studio, please consider leaving a rating or review online at Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. Inside the Writer's Studio posts new episodes on the 1st and 15th of every month. We've got a great lineup for you this fall, so be sure to keep tuning in. Until then, thanks for listening, and may you read with wonder and write with passion.